Hello, you fabulous people, and welcome to Wake Up on a Friday. This is our Friday investigation show where we like to deep dive into matters of public interest. I'm journalist and broadcaster Sonia Poulton, and you are simply fabulous. How are you? It's Friday, the 27th of February. It's just gone 9:01 a.m. GMT, and I am so grateful that you're here with me. Thank you to Robert and Emily and Sonia and Sky High and Marco and Colin and Steffi and Simon and on and on. How are you all? I hope you are well. And Cheryl and Katie and Drumstick and Lenticular Cloud and Merv Whitney and Randy and Mel's. How are you people? How are you? And Armand, how are you? Thank you for being here. I truly, truly appreciate it. Welcome to the show that knows if you want to stand out from the crowd, give people a reason not to forget you. Great quote attributed to the star of today's deep dive. I am enjoying doing this series so much. I look into the less celebrated sides of famous people and change makers, people who have a huge influence on our world, whether we like it or not. And thank you to everybody who's left comments, to those who have contacted me with further ideas. I appreciate that. At any one moment in time, I can have a dozen or more research files open as I slowly but deliberately start to fill them up with information I have gathered until the moment comes when I feel I've found enough to justify a report, just as I am today. If you haven't already seen the other episodes, I've also covered Bono and Elton John and Sir Richard Attenborough. So why the dark side? Well, first off, as I've said before, I am not anyone. I cover these people because as a journalist, I have a duty to report matters of public interest. And if there was a criminal issue, then I also have a duty to go to the police. No, what I am covering here is the idea that some of the people who seem to be living at the highest reaches of our society are very bad news indeed. They have been prepared to make agreements that perhaps someone with better morals wouldn't. They have been prepared to offer up the world for the comfort of the few. I thought The Dark Side was a good title for it because the heroes aren't who the world has been told they are. When I start these live investigations, I have no idea how long they will take. I have endless notes. So please bear with me. And it could be an hour, it could be 2 hours. And either way, be sure to take a break in between if you need it. So Richard Branson, or as he's more formally known these days, Sir Richard Branson, knighted for services to entrepreneurship and big time entrepreneurial skills does this man have. I can't fault that. He's had his little pudgy fingers into a multitude of industries for decades, including music, flying, transportation, health, media, communications, and even space travel. Yes, indeed, he entered the dick race. Richard Branson is one of the UK's most successful businessmen in modern times. His Virgin businesses are so much more than a brand. They are him, which is why in this investigation, we will also look at his choice of name in the first place. Richard Branson is influential on matters of significant public interest. And in 2007, he was named one of the 100 most influential people in the world by Time magazine. And he's rich too. The amount that he has varies, obviously. The last record appeared to be over $4 billion in June 2023. Forbes magazine claimed that his estimated net worth was $3 billion US. He's a British success story, one of our own, right? Shame he's been a tax exile for much of that. And yes, we'll look at his very iffy tax affairs today, given his propensity for using our fair land to sell much of his goods. The thing I've come to know and understand about Richard Branson is he is patriotic and proud to be British when he can flog something off the back of it. Branson is a chameleon. He has skillfully managed to create an impression of an easygoing, laid back kind of dude, right? That's how people see him. It's a very good marketing ploy. A man who can mix and mingle with everyone, whether you fancy a beer with him or a wheatgrass cocktail. A man who has managed to convince people that he's just a hippie at heart, while being a ruthless, at times savage, backstabbing, and problematic business operator. And this is the important part, often at public expense. It's a very good trick, that old laid back dude look, right? It's the same one that Bill Gates pulls in his comfy jumpers and jeans. It's disarming. If they came in suits, we would know what to look out for. We'd be more on guard. That's what we've learned through media propaganda. I spent well over a decade as a music journalist. I worked for newspapers and magazines that sent me out on showbiz and entertainment assignments. I met many famous people. I interviewed many famous people, and I heard about many famous people. Richard Branson was someone I long believed to be a good guy. So impressive is the marketing around him. He managed to convince me until he did two things. One involved missing child Madeleine McCann, and the other involved our National Health Service. And I will talk about both in a while. Since then, I've had my eye on him. And today is the first opportunity I have had to express it as fully as I'm about to. This is, to a degree, as I say, a live investigation. Even though I've brought together parts that I've checked and corroborated, I have discovered that it is in the telling of my research to you, my viewers, that I start to fully understand how it all fits together. So this is a bit of a journey for me as much as it is for you. So let's do this. Before I do that, I want to double check that everybody can hear me perfectly in the comments. Everything all right there, people? Another billionaire with a private island, says Owly. Indeed, absolutely. Don't mention the pearl necklace. Unwrap the meat of the story. Wasn't he the first person to buy an island? Right, you can hear me perfectly. Thank you, Jacqueline. Okay, loud and clear. Thank you, Shin. Thank you so much. So, Richard Charles Nicholas Branson was born on the 18th of July, 1950 in Blackheath, southeast London. His father, Edward James Branson, was a barrister, now passed. His mother, Yvette Huntley Branson, nee Flint, was a ballet dancer and air hostess. She was the founder and director of the Eve Branson Foundation. She, like him, called herself a philanthropist. She was interested in child welfare advocacy. She was also a board member of the International Centre for Missing and Exploited Children, and I will cover that in more detail later. And Branson's paternal grandfather, Sir George Arthur Harwin Branson, was a judge at the High Court of Justice and a Privy Councillor. So this is not someone who's come from a council house background, just to be clear on that. It was interesting because on the television series Finding Your Roots, Branson was shown to have 3.9% South Asian Indian DNA, which was likely through intermarriage. He later said that one of his great-great-great-great-grandmothers was Indian, named Raya. He's an atheist, believing more in humans taking care of each other than the existence of God. Well, we shall see exactly how far that truly extends in the life of Richard Branson. So he was educated, well, a number of places, but all very, very posh places. At Skatecliff School, a prep school in Surrey, at Cliffview House School in Sussex. He attended Stowe School, which is a public school in Buckinghamshire. And for our American viewers, public school is private, but it's kind of like above and beyond private. This is where politicians and royalty are educated, in public schools. Branson has told us repeatedly that he has dyslexia. He also talks often about his poor academic performance at school, and he tells this wonderful story, a wonderful anecdote, which goes down a storm, about how on his last day at school, his headmaster, Robert Drayson, told him he would either end up in prison or become a millionaire. And actually, it turned out that both were true. And Branson has also talked openly about having ADHD. And his mother had an entrepreneurial spirit, and her son seemed to have it too. At 16, Richard Branson launched a magazine named Student. Let's have a look at a young Branson, shall we? He launched this magazine called Student in 1966 with his friend Nick Powell. And the first issue of Student magazine appeared in January 1968. And he interviewed people such as Mick Jagger, who he later signed to Virgin Records. He set up a mail order business and used the magazine to advertise albums. Now, back in the 60s, this was really clever. This was really innovative stuff. And if there's anything at all I can give Richard Branson, he's a brilliant marketeer. And he also knows how to spot talent. He's a talent spotter and a marketeer. Anyway, so because what it did was it showed up his marketing acumen from a very young age, like at 16. And he's like, okay, this is what we're going to do. And we're going to flog records, but we're also going to have a magazine in which we're going to advertise them. Clever. It was clever. It was ahead of its time in the 60s. Can't take that away from him. But he also started to show his really dodgy side really early on. He took control of Student magazine after lying to his co-founder and mate, Nick Powell. He said that the workers on the magazine had opposed Powell's plans to turn the magazine into a cooperative. Now, the idea of a cooperative scared the money-minded Richard Branson. This is one of the earliest examples of how savage this apparent hippie was. He was interested in numero uno and sort of cooperative. And he was barely out of his teens with this attitude. Then he eventually started a record shop in Oxford Street in London. And in 1971, he was questioned in connection with the selling of records that he was declaring as export stock, and they weren't, not at all. He then agreed to pay unpaid purchase tax. He spent a night in a cell. The matter was never brought before a court, probably because it's too posh. And Branson agreed to repay any unpaid purchase tax of 33%, interesting amount, and a £70,000 fine, which huge amount of money in the 70s. And his parents were said to have remortgaged their home in order to help pay the settlement. But this is a real clear indicator of what was to come later, because the thing about Richard Branson that I discovered in my research is he's done everything he can over 4 or 5 decades to either avoid or minimize his tax bill in the UK. And again, the early patterns tell us so much about him. He, as I say, has spent a lifetime working to minimize and even dodge his tax. And the one that has proven so useful to him. And I object to people like Richard Branson, and you'll hear this as I go on. And one of the reasons being is because England and the UK is really useful to these people for marketing purposes, but not so much when it comes to actually paying their due amounts. He's had been married to his wife, Joan, for decades. She died recently. There was quite a lot in the mainstream media about it. In his autobiography, Losing My Virginity, and it's really important to just take note of that title, because they've done everything they can to move away from the sexual connotations that are attached to virgin. But losing my virginity really has only one meaning, doesn't it? And so in his autobiography, Losing My Virginity, Branson revealed how his first marriage to Kirsten Tomasi, an American lady, ended because they had complications after wife swapping sessions with a musician. So he was very much into wife swapping at that stage, maybe in later stages, but his wife, Joan, was much more private than him. She kept away from the public eye. And it was also interesting that Nick Powell, his mate, who he had backstabbed, and his long-suffering business partner, ended up marrying his first wife's sister, Meryl. That ended in divorce. And then Nick Powell ended up marrying Sandy Shaw, 60s singer. Richard Branson has tried an assortment of things. Well, he would, wouldn't he? And because he's that kind of man. And I have no problem with somebody's entrepreneurial spirit. Nice little image there, just to set the scene, as it were. I have no problems whatsoever with people's entrepreneurial skills or abilities. I love that, actually. It's creative and wonderful, something I really support, except if it's somebody like Richard Branson. So he has tried his hand at many things. And in 1967, around the time that he was running Student magazine, he also established a student advisory centre in London. And it was essentially to provide confidential advice on sexuality and abortion. He was only 17, and he's publicly advocated for safe legal access to abortion. No problem with that either, arguing that it's a personal choice that government should not interfere with. And I tend to agree, although I think it's really curious that a 17-year-old male is opening a clinic that is advising people on abortion and sexuality. I think that is interesting, very interesting stuff. Lord help us, says Cheryl. And but I think for many people, Branson really came to fame with his first big venture, Virgin Records, in 1972, which he actually launched with Nick Powell, the guy that he'd lied to and taken control of Student magazine, the guy who had married his wife's sister, and now they together launched Virgin Records. Some people never learn, right? And but clearly Nick Powell hadn't had quite his fill of his friend being an untrustworthy backstabber. But the thing is about Virgin is Branson was always the face of Virgin. In fact, many people think that Branson was the only person behind Virgin, but that wasn't true. It was also Nick Powell, who was less of a limelight seeker than Richard Branson. Some people have said to me before, certainly when I was a music journalist, they compared people like Puff Daddy, Diddy, with Richard Branson, because it was never enough for Richard Branson to be in the background as a record executive, and it was never enough for Puffy to be in the background. They always wanted to be front and center. And but what he also did, again, showing his business acumen, excellent business acumen. Again, I can't fault it. But what he did, in addition to launching Virgin Records, was he also bought a property in the Oxfordshire countryside, the Manor Studio. And what he did is he leased studio time to up and coming artists. And this included the multi-instrumentalist Mike Oldfield. Now, I had a best friend who worked at Virgin for years, and I never picked up much gossip about Richard Branson at all. I always got the impression that people were quite loyal to him at Virgin. Very interesting. I thought he was down to earth man who had done good. And in my 20s, I ran my own small independent record label. It was called Go for the Juggler. And I actually contacted Richard Branson about a meeting. I was interested in doing business with him. And I was a practical unknown, right? But I reached for the stars. That's kind of like my attitude to things. But to my surprise, this big boss of Virgin Records wrote back personally to me, and he encouraged me to keep going. He told me to build up my roster. He said, my artists look great, just needed to do some more work with them, build up my roster, do more marketing. And then once I'd done that, after about a year, I should get back in touch with him. So I was really impressed with that. The label didn't actually last, and I went back into music journalism, but I was really impressed with that. I thought, well, he's a really okay sort of down-to-earth geezer who's encouraging people. I thought, wow. And until I realized who he really is, then I changed my tune. So Virgin, let's talk about Virgin, shall we? Virgin, the word. Interesting, right? The official version of why it's called Virgin was that it was suggested by one of Branson's earlier employees because they were all new at business. Well, that sounds kind of good, doesn't it? But we all know what we think of when we hear the word virgin. We associate it with sex and sexual experience. It generally refers to someone without experience in sexual matters, including intercourse. It also refers to someone inexperienced in a particular activity, e.g., like a first-time flyer. I'm a virgin flyer, although now it has different meanings because obviously he has an airline. It also suggests something that is untouched, is pristine, that kind of attitude, really. Let me just plug this in a second. And but I think primarily it does suggest to most people a sexual connotation, a person who has never had sexual intercourse, kind of like an unmarried person, an unmarried girl, an unmarried woman, an unmarried boy. But I do think that primarily it has sexual connotations. And let's have a look. The logo has blood dripping too. We'll get to the logo. Marcuson, if you think we won't talk about that logo, you got another thing coming, right? But I think ultimately what we're looking at here is somebody, and I think I've realized that by the end of my research, well, not by the end of it, but as I research more and more, we're looking at someone with a big interest in sex, because who else considers giving sexual advice at the age of 17 and then calls their company Virgin. And bear in mind that that Virgin logo and Virgin as a company name is recognized all over the world. So immediately, from a kind of psychological perspective, as soon as you see it, it immediately puts you in a certain state of mind. So he can say whatever he wants about them all being new to it and everything. He truly can. But there's no way on earth that I believe that he didn't choose it because of the sexual connotations. That's what I believe. Absolutely, I do. So also we know when Virgin Cruises are sex mad, I see. HMV on Oxford Street was mad. That I remember it all. I remember those times well. So whichever way you look at it, the overriding understanding of the word virgin is someone who is sexually inexperienced and has never had sex. Bottom line. So going back to Virgin Records, Tubular Bells with Mike Oldfield, who had recorded at the Manor Studios, very savvy ploy of Richard Branson. So Tubular Bells in 1973 was the first release for Virgin Records and Mike Oldfield in May 1973. And it's interesting about Tubular Bells because there are only 2 songs on the entire album. Side 1 has Tubular Bells Part 1 and side 2 has Tubular Bells Part 2. And Oldfield, as I say, a multi-instrumentalist, plays nearly every instrument on the album. And it seemed a really odd choice for a pop hit at the time, but it became a huge chart topper, a bestseller. And there was also a reason for that. And do we recognize these images? It's from The Exorcist. Tubular Bells was chosen for the big horror movie at the time, The Exorcist. Now, The Exorcist was a huge horror movie, massive. My sister-in-law went to see it with my brother when she was 18 and had to be carried out of the cinema because she fainted, and it had a huge impact on a lot of people. And a lot of it was kind of like social conditioning because it kind of whipped around that everybody was like, terrified at The Exorcist. But nonetheless, The Exorcist was hugely kind of propped up by Tubular Bells. And it's an iconic and critical piece of The Exorcist, actually. The song only plays twice in the movie, but it is associated hugely with the movie. The first is at the beginning of the film when the mum is walking home, and the music already creates this kind of unnerving and mysterious atmosphere. And it also creates this sense of impending doom, and it tells you to buckle up. And for those who aren't familiar with The Exorcist, it's a story of a young girl who becomes possessed by the devil, and then the vicar and the priest come around to hold to get the devil out of her. And Nikki actually relates Tubular Bells to The Exorcist. Got you. Okay. And the second use of Tubular Bells in The Exorcist is towards the end. So it's at the beginning and at the end, which in itself are really important points. And what happens is that you see it at the end, and as you kind of leave or as you end the film, it has this lingering hauntedness to it. Anyway, as a consequence of that, the record ended up selling what was roughly between 10 and 20 million records. Now, imagine a record label and your first release is selling that volume. Mike Oldfield himself put the record sales at 16 million, had that on his website. And it was also remixed for later versions of The Exorcist. But nonetheless, in the 1970s, Virgin Records, Tubular Bells and The Exorcist were synonymous. And I think that was interesting. So that was an early and huge hit for Branson, massively so. And what a great way to start off a business. Most people would not complain about that whatsoever. Let's just bring in an image of him. Let's come back to that, actually. And so what happened was he began to branch out his businesses in related areas. And in 1982, Virgin purchased the gay bar Heaven in London, in Charing Cross. I loved Heaven. I started going in the mid-80s when I moved to London, and I started working at the Empire in Leicester Square. I was first of all in the cigarette kiosk, and then I was at front of house. And everybody who worked in nightclubs around that time, probably still now, I'm sure, all knew each other. And so I let their staff in free into the Empire. Don't tell my boss. And they, as a consequence, all nightclubs in the West End let me in free because we all knew each other, and that was how it worked. And I discovered a whole new world in Heaven. believe me, right? My eyes opened up. I was a young girl from the Cotswolds. I'd led, to all intents and purposes, a fairly kind of quite a shaded life to a certain degree, even though it was quite what would be considered dysfunctional. But nonetheless, my eyes opened when I got to heaven, because all manner of things were happening there, probably that I can't even repeat here. Then he attempted to branch into TV. He had a consortium with TV presenter David Frost. They made an unsuccessful bid for 3 ITV franchises, so that didn't work. His one shot at being a producer, again, kind of like I reference Diddy a little bit here. So he attempted to be a producer in the early 1980s. They produced this novelty record, which was called Bar Bar Black Sheep. It was the singing sheep, and it reached number 42 in the UK charts in 1982. But it was absolutely evident that Branson's talent was business, not creativity. And it was, but also the other thing that he recognized was that compilations could be a really big business deal. And so it was Virgin Records who launched the phenomenally successful Now That's What I Call Music series. That was 1983. I remember I had like the first 5 or 6 of Now That's What I Call Music, which was a compilation of pop music at that time. And it was hugely, hugely successful. And Virgin signed lots of controversial bands that often couldn't get record deals anywhere else, such as, for example, the Sex Pistols. He also signed the Rolling Stones, Peter Gabriel, Culture Club, UB40, and at one stage became the world's largest independent record label. But there was also disturbing material that was released on Virgin. And as one example is Joan Baez, and she released her album Play Me Backwards in 1992. Now, this was around about the time that he was preparing to sell Virgin, but it's really interesting because this song, Play Me Backwards, I am in no doubt whatsoever is about satanic ritual abuse. Of that, I'm in no doubt whatsoever. And I'll read you some of the lyrics, okay? You don't have to play me backwards to get the meaning of my verse. You don't have to die and go to heaven to feel the devil's curse. I've seen them light the candles. I've heard them bang the drum. And I've cried, Mama, I'm cold as ice and I've got no place to run. Let the night begin. There's a pop of skin and the sudden rush of scarlet. There's a little boy riding on a goat's head and a little girl playing the harlot. There's a sacrifice in an empty church of sweet little baby Rose, and a man in a mask from Mexico is peeling off my clothes. I'll stand before your altar and tell everything I know. I've come to claim my childhood at the chapel of baby Rose. And I am in no doubt whatsoever that that is about the abuse of children, and that was released on Virgin. No, I'm in no doubt whatsoever. It's demonic, Humphrey. No doubt whatsoever. And that was the early days. But the thing is, you know what it takes, right? It takes so much experience, because at the time, who realized that? I don't think, I mean, maybe some did, but it wasn't kind of like now where we can actually have an opportunity where we can discuss it online and kind of pull it apart and examine it and analyze it. Drumstick, who made that song? Joan Baez. Or did she pronounce her name Baez? I think it was Joan Baez. She pronounced her name. And, but, you know, huge star at the time. And it will be forgotten. Yes. And that's a really good point, Sail Away. If we don't repeat info, it will be forgotten. But I think it's really important to note right at the beginning, they were putting out music like that. And so let's talk about this Virgin brand logo, which I do believe our Markson mentioned in the comments. Let me see if I can bring it in here. So I'm just trying to set the scene for you, you wonderful people. So here's the Virgin logo. The brand licenses to a multitude of places. It's highly recognizable. And just to bear in mind that Richard Branson's motto often in business is screw it, let's do it, right? That's often his motto. And the original logo is absolutely based on young girls and virginity, even though, as I say, they've done everything they can to escape from that. Now, the original logo, I managed to track down the person who actually made the original Virgin logo, which is not this one. This one has now since changed, but the original Virgin logo was designed by Roger Dean, and it was in the early 1970s, and he designed it for Richard Branson. And it was because he'd started doing record covers, and it was was very much in the theme of a 1960s. It was quite Sergeant Pepperish design, and it was based on the Gemini twins, and they were nude, and it said Virgin. So again, nobody can tell me that Virgin wasn't set up, and it was about kind of like sexual connotations and young girls. And but this, what you see on the screen now, is the more common Virgin logo. And many people say that the Virgin logo looks as if it's been written in blood. Many people say that. It's certainly not standard font, is it? But he, as I say, you know, Richard Branson and the Virgin logo are synonymous, even though he doesn't actually own every company that he now licenses the Virgin logo to. And he makes millions each year by the amount of different companies that he licenses the Virgin logo to. But some people, they're under the kind of assumption that if it's Virgin, whatever, right? I mean, and there's multitude stuff. There's Virgin Records, there's Virgin Balloons, there's Virgin Airways, there's Virgin Railways, there's Virgin Media, there's Virgin Radio. It goes on and on and on. But some people, whenever they see the Virgin logo, they automatically associate it with Richard Branson. That's strong marketing branding. That's I remember the first logo. It was on the. Who says this? Wait. Who says that? I remember the first logo. It was on the Frontline Reggae album. Well done, Robert. It absolutely was. And as I say, and it was essentially, that logo was set around like the Garden of Eden. And there was the, as I say, the Gemini twins, and they were portrayed as young girls, nude young girls in the Garden of Eden, and snakes all around them, and Virgin. And so they can say whatever they want about the origin of the name Virgin and the logo, but we know the truth. We know the truth, Richard, and we're on to you. And today we're going to expose you. Oh, yes, indeed. So Branson, the entrepreneur, he wanted his fingers in many pies, and he formed Virgin Atlantic and Virgin Cargo in 1984, and then he formed Virgin Holidays in 1985. Legend has it, and he's really good on legends, right? And good mythological stories. But legend has it that Branson's first successful venture into the airline industry was during a trip to Puerto Rico. His flight was cancelled, so he decided to charter his own plane the rest of the way, and he offered a ride to the rest of the stranded passengers for a small fee to cover the costs. And that was said to be the genesis, the start of Virgin Atlantic. He sold Virgin Records to EMI in 1992 to keep Virgin Atlantic afloat, and he sold it for 500 million. And as you will hear later, again, not opaque, lots of interesting tax dealings when he sold that. And that was right back in 1992. In fact, let's be clear. I am absolutely stating that from the beginning of Richard Branson's businesses, when he was 16 years old, he's done everything he can to minimize and even avoid paying tax. And I am not calling him a tax evader, because that is criminal. Tax avoidance is legal in this country, albeit I consider it immoral. Anyway, after Virgin Records and after selling that, he then launched V2 Records in 1996 because he wanted to re-enter the music business. He only owned 5% himself. And again, going back to what I've said, and that is, a lot of the time people think, oh, that must be Richard Branson, because the Virgin insignia is just so well known now. And I have to say that when I was a music journalist, I flew on Virgin Atlantic a ton of times. It was the favored airline for the music industry. People absolutely loved it, and probably they had discounts or whatever. But I thought it was actually a great airline. I really did. I enjoyed it. I thought the services and facilities were great. And again, it kind of added to the whole idea that Richard Branson is a good guy. He's a businessman who wants to make money, but he's going to give us a good service as well. But since then, I've heard obviously lots of things about Virgin Atlantic, but my experience when I was using it on a regular basis, sometimes once a month, my experience was it was good. But then I was actually drunk a lot of the time as well, because those were the days when you could get so drunk on flights and smoke. And I smoked cigarettes at the time, so I just had a whale of a time on my flight. So I probably can't actually remember much, in truth, but it always seemed really good to me. Then we heard lots about kind of dirty tricks campaigns. Don't know if you remember that. There were these disputes in the early 1990s between Virgin Atlantic and British Airways. And obviously, British Airways, which was an established flight operator, it viewed Virgin as this emerging competitor. And Virgin subsequently accused British Airways of poaching its passengers, of hacking its computers, and leaking stories to the press that portrayed Virgin negatively. Anyway, the campaign was called Dirty Tricks, right? It became known as that in the press. And British Airways and Virgin settled the case. British Airways actually ended up giving Branson £500,000, £500,000, a further £110,000 to his airline, and had to pay legal fees of up to £3 million. And this is really good marketing, because what we were told at the time was Branson distributed his compensation to his staff. Now, that was never clear whether that was the $500,000 or that was the 110,000. And it looks amazing, doesn't it? What great PR that this boss of Virgin is giving his compensation to his staff. But what did it really amount to? Whether it was $500,000 or whether it's 110,000 is almost immaterial, because what they don't tell us, and what they didn't tell us at the time, was how many staff benefited from this, or how much each one got, whether it was just the airline staff or Virgin staff in general. It's deliberately light on details because that makes better PR than what the potential actual story is. Nonetheless, I noted that it gets an entry in Wikipedia, and it's just kind of presented like that, Richard Branson, decent guy, gave his compensation to his staff. But the problem about Wikipedia is that it seldom questions whatever it picks up from mainstream media, and it treats stuff like this as fact without delving deeper. But the reality is, how many people was that compensation divided between? And I suspect that because when you hear it like $500,000, oh my God, they must have made a fortune. I doubt it. I doubt that very much. Anyway, they may have got a couple of grand or something like that, which is still great. But the point is that the initial story was like, what an incredible man giving all this money to his staff. The other thing that happened, and this was quite a cause of controversy, because it involved immunity for Virgin when they shouldn't have had it. And it was in June 2006, there was a tip-off from Virgin Atlantic that led to both British and American competition authorities investigating price fixing attempts between Virgin Atlantic and British Airways. So they were both allegedly at it, which you're not allowed to. And what happened was, in August 2007, British Airways was fined $271 million over the allegations. But Virgin was given immunity because they were the ones to snitch on it. Right. This was a very controversial decision. The Office of Fair Trading defended it as being in the public interest, but it was fairly outrageous, because it would appear that both British Airways and Virgin were up to the same tricks, but because Virgin came out first and kind of said, this is what's going on, they were given immunity. And British Airways were fined $271 million. So that also tells you quite a lot about their business dealings. And again, it reminds me, that whole snitching, the backstabbing thing, it reminds me very much of what he did to Nick Powell in the early days. And you could tell people do change, obviously. But if at the age of 16 and 17, you're trying to get control of your business venture from your young partner and based on a lie, then it kind of tells you rather a lot about that individual. Anyway, since then, he's branched out into all manner of different airlines in Brussels, in Nigeria. He's also got other connections within America, Virgin America. He's also got a stake in Malaysian Airlines. And he's always desired to look hip, right? Even though actually in reality, he's probably a little bit nerdy. Nothing wrong with that. I love nerdy people. But what happened with the airlines is that he wanted to be seen as very progressive. So he told his female air hostesses that they didn't need to wear makeup. And although most of them still do, and most of them look great without it anyway, because I presume they are selecting attractive women from the outset. But he also told male air hostesses that they could wear makeup. So he told women, you don't need to wear makeup, and men, you can. Odd. And as you will see as we go on, this is very much a nod to Branson's queer agenda. He's very much involved in the LGBTQ plus push, and from the perspective of the kind of globalist perspective, not in the let us protect people from being hurt by bigotry, not at all. And he ran this all-inclusive ad, and the tune they used was "I Am What I Am." And what you had was women flying. Like, this wasn't even that long ago. It's like, get a grip. This is not progressive anymore. It's like women do fly aircraft. It's just no one gives a shite about that stuff except people like Branson. It's the globalist idea of progress, you know. And so this ad had women flying the aircraft, men in makeup, you know, kind of shuffling up and down the cabin. And as you will discover, Branson himself was not averse to dressing up in women's clothes and putting on makeup and styling himself in the image of a woman. And he extended that, as I say, to Virgin Airlines advertising. And it all felt a bit unnecessary, actually, and a bit kind of manipulative. And I would actually go so far as to say Branson is probably a cross-dresser, because he's dressed up in women's clothes so often and so frequently for his various campaigns. And also, in terms of like Virgin Airlines, anybody remember this? This is him in October 2019. He began Virgin's new route between London Heathrow and Tel Aviv, and he called Israel a land of great entrepreneurs doing incredible things. And upon landing in Israel, he was photographed kissing the ground, a gesture which is traditionally performed by visitors arriving in Israel. It seemed very much as a clear nod to Zionism and the occupation there. But here he is, he's down on his knees for the globalist parasites. That's what he is. There he is, right down on his knees. Well done, Richard. Big up yourself. And I'm going to bring back this one. I think it sums up a lot of what I'm talking about today. And as I say, he's run so many businesses. I mean, so many businesses. He also has had a stab at Virgin Rail. He had one of the longest franchises in British history. In 1997, he entered into the railway business, and it was during the privatization of British Rail. This man has always been very acutely aware of when things are going to be privatized and how he can get something out of it. And he ended up running this franchise of railways for just over 15 years. Actually, no, it was originally scheduled for 15 years, and they ended up running for just over 22 years. And it began serving the West Coast Main Line. And so that was going up more to the north of England. And there was a horrible tragedy in 2007 on one of his trains. It derailed in Cumbria. It resulted in a fatality. It was traveling at 95 miles per hour. It hit a damaged set of points. Margaret Masson, who was 84, was killed, and over 80 passengers were injured, many seriously. And what he did was he went down to the site. And again, that lent itself to the suggestion that this was a decent bloke who was running a business, and when tragedy struck, he was there on hand. And again, it all, really good stuff. Sounded all really good stuff, but now I know better, and I know that almost everything that Richard Branson has ever done is about maintaining a public image. And it wouldn't surprise me if he even learned from the royal family, because they were often criticized, and the Queen in particular, when bad situations happened and the Queen didn't turn up, they were often criticized. So this is a very savvy man. It would not surprise me if he had learned that if a tragedy happens, you get there ASAP. And he's also tried, of course, space travel. That's kind of ongoing. And for me, that feels like a bit of a dick race between Richard Branson, Elon Musk, and Jeff Bezos of Amazon. Virgin Galactic, he said he wants to make space travel possible. And I'm pretty sure it's already possible. But what I don't understand with these people, these extraordinary wealthy people, wouldn't it be wonderful to fix the earth first and make sure that everyone has enough of what they actually need, enough to launch their own entrepreneurial startups, right? Virgin Galactic was this kind, is a aerospace company. It was founded in 2004. The idea, he said, was to connect people with the wonder of space. And the flight experiences that passengers experience several minutes of weightlessness, views of Earth and space, with the journey lasting approximately 2 hours. And there have been problems with it. The company is aiming to return to operations this year after an extended pause. And the idea is that they are working towards a high frequency flight model, intending to make space travel a regular occurrence, but it will only be a regular occurrence for rich people. And the thing about Richard Branson is, again, he talks about, I want to make this available to everybody. But what you actually discover is that what he gets involved in things like this and his island, which we'll talk about shortly, is really only for the rich. Is really only for the rich. That is the reality with him. But he does talk a good talk, so we can't forget that. And I remember seeing him in an interview with Stephen Bartlett, Diary of a CEO. And the thing about Stephen Bartlett, who's also in the Dragon's Den, is that he puts a human spin on some of the most greedy and aggressively toxic individuals in our world, corporate CEOs, earning huge amounts of money while often presenting themselves as benevolent individuals. And Stephen Bartlett did this interview with Richard Branson, where Richard Branson talked about his trip to space, about how it was an extraordinary experience, about how he had to pinch himself, that we're in an aircraft that we built, that we're in a spaceship that we built, rather. And he also, in that podcast with Stephen Bartlett, he talks about the death of one of the pilots in the test. There was a death, and this was in the lead up to Virgin Galactic going to space, and an astronaut died in the tests. And he was asked by Stephen Bartlett whether that, and I'm paraphrasing him, whether that kind of put you off of going forward. And he's like, well, but the bottom line is this, is nothing gets in the way of Richard Branson. And that includes the death of a pilot in tests. Then nothing gets in the way of Richard Branson once he's decided he wants to do something. But all of those space missions, I think they're a bit of a kind of nothingness, really. And it feels very much egotistical, because honestly, if you're that rich as Branson, Bezos and Musk, a fraction of your wealth could solve world hunger issues properly. And I don't mean just giving them money so that corrupt dictators could then take it. I'm talking about proper initiatives that could solve world hunger, could solve the dilemma that many people have, and that is whether they can eat or heat, even clean water. But no, these people want to take part in their dick race. And that is the reality. That's how I see them all. They appall me. If I had that kind of money, you can be sure I would be finding a way to alleviate pain in this world. Absolutely. So that is a message to the universe. Give me that amount of money and watch me work to alleviate pain and hunger in this world. I will not do a Richard Branson. Anyway, continued with his more business enterprises, so many more. He launched Virgin Mobile in 1999. In 2006, he sold Virgin Mobile to NTL TeleWest for 900 million. Makes huge amount of money from his launches, and a lot of it is to do with the Virgin name. That's it. And a new company was launched in 2007 under the name Virgin Media. And what they did was they merged Virgin Media with NTL, and Branson actually had owned 3/4 of Virgin Mobile, but now he would get paid 8.5 million per annum for the use of the Virgin brand name. He does not own any part of Virgin Media, but again, makes millions each year from it being called Virgin. And my experience of Virgin Media is it is an awful company. I had Virgin Phone and Internet because they were claiming that they had the fastest speeds, and I wanted it for my live streaming. It repeatedly broke down. It was always there was always work taking place on it, and it became ludicrously expensive by the end of it. And this was like 2-3 years ago. They were charging me £82 a month. That's really expensive. That's like over double what I'm paying now. So yeah, this is a man, and the companies that he allows his name to be used for, they know how to exploit people. That's what they do. And a lot of it is based on good marketing, because Virgin Media was sold on this idea that it was the fastest broadband speed. So as a streamer, I was like, I want that. But it didn't turn out to be the way. It was absolutely awful. And he's done loads of other things. In 2006, he formed Virgin Comics, Virgin Animation, an entertainment company which focused on creating new stories and characters. And the aim was it was for a global audience. The company was founded with Deepak Chopra, or Chopra. I'm never quite sure how to pronounce that. But he's recently appeared in the Epstein files, of course. There are many personal and professional relationship correspondence between Deepak Chopra and Jeffrey Epstein. And the files actually reveal quite a deep connection between the pair. And this is supposed to be a spiritual man, right? But he talks to Epstein frequently about things like when he invited Epstein to join him on trips, he explicitly told him to bring your girls. There was some of the dialogue between them was extremely controversial. And Deepak wrote things like, God is a construct, cute girls are real. This is supposed to be a spiritual person, no? And they had conversations, things like Deepak would say to him things like, I'm not a predator, just a lover, which really seems, again, very, very odd for somebody who has been sold to us as a deeply spiritual individual. And that's not to say, it's not to say you can't have sex and love and be spiritual, right? It's not to say that. But some of these conversations with Epstein were problematic, deeply problematic. Anyway, Branson launched comics with him. And then, of course, you know, it all kind of fell by the wayside. Loads of other ventures that Branson tried, including the Virgin Health Bank, which he launched in 2007, which offered expectant parents the opportunity to store their baby's umbilical cord blood stem cells in private and public stem cell banks. And it was established, they said, to collect, process, and store stem cells from the umbilical cord blood that may be used and needed in future for treating blood disorders. Well, my audience right now have got their ears pricking up, because we all know what we're all thinking. We all know what we're all thinking. Okay. And then, as I say, loads of other things, Virgin Radio, Virgin Money. In October 2007, Branson's Virgin Group, they wanted to add Northern Rock to their empire. They submitted an offer, and Branson ended up personally owning 30% of the company, changed its name from Northern Rock to Virgin Money. The Daily Mail ran a campaign to stop the bid. Vince Cable, who was financial spokesperson for the Liberal Democrats at the time and my local MP, suggested in the House of Commons that Branson's criminal conviction for tax evasion, because it was tax evasion initially, right, might be felt by some as a good enough reason not to trust him with public money. You think? But, you know, Branson constantly branching out. In 2010, he launched Virgin Hotels, in 2018, he announced the first Virgin Hotel in the UK. It would open in Edinburgh. Beautiful city. Love Edinburgh. Great location. Great choice. And then he had an assortment of acquisitions over the world, including in Las Vegas. And also, so Virgin Hotels, they opened Las Vegas Hotel in March 2021. So all over, really. And I mentioned earlier about when I really went off him, and it was to do with it's to do with two things. It was to do with Madeleine McCann, which I will talk about, but it was also to do with his involvement in healthcare. And I had a lot of bigly problems with his involvement with healthcare. So I'm going to tell you about them. So in January 2008, Virgin Healthcare announced that it would open a chain of healthcare clinics that would offer conventional medicine alongside homeopathic and complementary therapies. And that seemed, again, very progressive, very advanced. Of course, now we know the NHS won't fund anything which is considered alternative. It is all allopathic medicine at the NHS. And what happened was in April 2012, Virgin Care commenced a 5-year contract for provision of a range of health services which had previously been under NHS Surrey, which was the local primary care trust. And by March 2015, Virgin Care was in charge of more than 230 services nationwide. So eating up these services nationwide, right? That's what they're doing. And the role was a little bit questionable because what happened was people would go to Virgin Healthcare and then they would be referred to the NHS. So they were some kind of stepping stone to the NHS, and some of it was a bit problematic. To say the least. Anyway, what happened was that Richard Branson was definitely part of the depletion of the National Health Service. So a little bit of background information, and that is when David Cameron and Nick Clegg came into power, and they had a coalition government, which I believe was 2010/2011 election, and none of them got enough to have, the entire so they had to split it as a coalition government between the Conservatives and the Lib Dem. And that was one of the greatest attacks on not only sick and disabled in our country, but also our National Health Service. And it was very much about the privatisation of the National Health Service. And there was greedy old Richard Branson realising that this was another way that he could make a great deal of money. Let me just have a glug of water, people, because this infuriates me, the depletion of our National Health Service. How you all doing in the comments? How you all doing? And having a conversation. So the attack on the NHS. So as I say, at the time, it was the Tory Lib Dem government, and they were absolutely savaging and attacking our National Health Service. And the key detail here is the controversial lawsuit. So what happened was Virgin Care sued 6 NHS clinical commissioning groups, NHS England and Surrey County Council, in 2016-2017. And that was after they lost an £82 million contract to provide children's services. And they claimed that there were serious flaws in the procurement process. And in November 2017, the NHS paid an undisclosed sum, reported to be around 2 million, to Virgin Care in and out of court settlement. So we never got to know the full amount, but it was reported to be 2 million. Now, bear in mind that the NHS is now being severely depleted. And because Branson did not get the contract that he wanted, he went and sued the NHS. And of course, he hid behind the company and all that, as he always did, because it's really useful to be able to do that, right? But what we do know almost certainly is that by 2018, Virgin's health arm had been awarded nearly 2 billion in NHS contracts. They were making an absolute fortune from the NHS. And in 2021, Virgin Care was sold to a private equity firm and rebranded as HCRG Care Group. It ended at that point the direct ties to the Virgin Group brand, though it continues to operate services within the NHS. And Virgin Care said at the time about the suing of the NHS that they intended that the reason that they had done it was that they intended to ensure a proper, fair tender process rather than specifically wanting to sue. But the action itself was very, very clear. And I do wonder whether he ended up selling Virgin Care because of the controversy and the backlash. It was a serious dent to his reputation, because that was the point when the public were like, wait a second, he's actually suing the National Health Service. So that was really weird. I mean, it was a high court ruling. They lost a high court ruling, the NHS did. And so really, it was really problematic. And, some of the reporting at the time really showed the impact it actually had on the NHS, because as one example, there was 243,000 which was diverted from frontline NHS services to cover legal fees of this court hearing. And It honestly, the court case really, what it did was it really showed us what has now become a trend of NHS disputes between public and private firms over contracts to provide care around the country. So these private contractors came in because politicians, some of whom had had their offices furnished by private healthcare companies, voted for them. And then when these private companies don't get the contracts they want, they then sue the NHS. It's extraordinary stuff. He began the dismantling of the NHS then. Yeah, I think it's safe to say that he definitely contributed to it. Definitely contributed to it. Now, again, I take nothing away from him being a savvy businessman, but I just think that his morals leave something to be desired. But in terms of being savvy, this has to be one of the savviest. This is a genius stroke. He purchased this. This is Necker Island, and he purchased it in the British Virgin Islands in 1978. Interesting, British Virgin Islands, right? In 1978, a 74-acre private island in the middle of the Caribbean, his own paradise on earth, as he has called it. Then, in all fairness, it was this isolated lump of like barren rock. And what it did was it allowed him to legitimize his offshore status. He set up a home in a tax-free state where he could lawfully avoid paying British taxes. And it ain't cheap to stay on Necker Island, which is what I say is that he talks about kind of like, you know, a humanitarian. Remember, he said that he's an atheist because he essentially believes that humans will take care of each other through humanitarian efforts, but it doesn't always extend to the Bransons. So Necker Island is extremely, extremely expensive to stay on. So there are rooms and there's suites. It can host up to 40 adults and 6 children. And a night stay can be around $4,000. But if you want to actually rent Necker, then we are for a period of days. Then we are talking hundreds of thousands of pounds. And in fact, for one person, a 7-night stay is £36,140. That is not for your regular person. I don't care what anybody says. Who can afford to pay for one person 36 grand a week? It's extraordinary stuff. And anybody remember when there was the Necker fire and Kate Winslet, the actress, came out and had apparently saved his mum? How much for an hour, says documentalists. Good point. And so that a couple of years back now, even longer, but his home was destroyed by fire. It's now been rebuilt. And so what they often do now is they also rent out the island per night. And if they rent out the island per night, it's approximately $60,000. And what he now lives on Necker and actually has done for a rather long time, but it took him about 7 years to fess up and admit it, which I will talk about. But here's where it gets interesting. Obviously, a private island, all manner of things can happen on private islands, okay? And all manner of things did happen on Necker. And so anybody remember the NXIVM sex cult parties? And that was the kind of like Rothschild-linked Bronfman sisters. They donated millions to the NXIVM sex cult. And the leaders, Alison Mack and Keith Rainier, were charged with child sex trafficking. Well, the NXIVM sex cult had an event on Necker. Now, it wasn't held by Richard Branson. It was held by them, but it was on Necker. And, you know, some people are like, wait, what? And, you know, eventually a lot came out about it and people were giving money to this cult and it was trafficking and it was involved in the abuse of children. So, you know, quite concerning stuff. And NXIVM, it really was a criminal cult. They disguised it as a multi-level marketing self-help organization. And it was founded by Keith Rainier in 1998. It was based in New York. It operated an executive success program. But really, the truth is that behind all of that it was functioning as this coercive group involved in sex trafficking, forced labor, blackmail, and it led to Rainier's 2019 conviction and sentencing to 120 years in prison. Well, they parted on Necker. They parted on Necker. And when you start to think about private islands, right? I'd love a private island. Who wouldn't want to buy a private island? But that was really savvy of him to buy it so cheap back then, and then kind of like, do it up and turn it into this luxury location. But when you start to look at who else owns private islands, well, you have people like Larry Ellison, who owns Oracle and who has taken over TikTok. Leonardo DiCaprio, he owns a private island. And everybody knows that Leonardo DiCaprio is always with females who are not even half his age, usually less. There's this not funny joke that does the rounds about Leonardo DiCaprio's girlfriend, about how she couldn't be at his 40th birthday because she wasn't yet born. And it's not really very funny, is it? Because we know what it actually means. And then you have people like Tyler Perry, Hollywood director and producer. Lots of things have been said about Tyler Perry. Tyler Perry was one of those Hollywood producers, black Hollywood producers, who was really keen on putting black men in dresses for a period of time, including himself, to go along with the agenda. And so interesting people have private islands. And of course, we can't forget the fact that Jeffrey Epstein had his own private island, which was only about a 20-minute journey from Branson's private island. Many famous guests have stayed on Necker. As I say, Kate Winslet, who was there when the fire broke out, Ronnie and Sally Wood, Ronnie Wood from the Rolling Stones, David Hasselhoff, formerly of Baywatch, Rachel Hunter, formerly Mrs. Rod Stewart, Natalie Imbruglia, pop star who was actually friends with Richard Branson's daughter, Holly, Harry Styles, formerly of One Direction. And really odd image emerged of Harry Styles in a hot tub with Richard Branson and other people. And that was when Harry Styles was said to be kind of like dating Taylor Swift at that time. And then there's people like Boris Becker, former Wimbledon champ, Kate Moss, after her cocaine Kate scandal. Non-British viewers, people who live outside, might not be aware of this big scandal of Kate Moss. And she was pictured on the front pages of the tabloids with coke and in a recording studio, pictures that had been taken that she wasn't aware of. And well, I don't know about obviously, but anyway, they ended up on the front page of the tabloids, and she went off to Necker to escape. And she ended up having a fling with a friend of Branson's son, Sam, male model Jamie Burke. And that was all also over the tabloids as well. Peter Gabriel, former Genesis star, he stayed there. So Mick Jagger stayed there. Gina Davis, actress. Ruby Wax said a really interesting quote about staying on Necker. She wrote in the Visitor's book, "For this kind of luxury, you can beat me to a pulp." Now, Ruby Wax is one of those quite awkward people, I find. But nonetheless, I find that quite an interesting comment, because what happened? What happened that you would write, "For this kind of luxury, you can beat me to a pulp"? What did actually happen? So interesting stuff. Harrison Ford has stayed there. Mel Gibson has stayed there. Robert De Niro, Eddie Murphy, George Michael, Mariah Carey. Mariah Carey was briefly signed to Virgin. And there was imagery which emerged of Mariah Carey and Richard Branson kind of like on a bed, a la Paulie Yates and The Big Breakfast, that sort of thing. Demi Moore, actor, was also there. Lots of political people have been to Necker. Nelson Mandela. They also formed this thing called the Elders with Kofi Annan, the former Secretary General of the United Nations, and Archbishop Desmond Tutu. And so that they were all there, and they, as I said, they formed these things called the Elders, which was looking into the problems to do with Africa. And you had like Richard Branson and Peter Gabriel involved in that, and they did that on Necker. And then you had Jimmy Carter, the former US president. Barack Obama's been on Necker with him, Tony Blair, and on, really. Lots and lots of people. All these celebs. Absolutely. And of course, Richard Branson has had more than his fair share of kind of honors, And that includes an honorary degree of Doctor of Technology from Loughborough University. He's also received awards for accomplishments in commercial air transportation. I think probably one of his favorite ones is his star on the Hollywood Walk of Fame under the category of recording for co-founding Virgin Records. And he was given that in 2018. And of course, where would any self-respecting pawn of the British establishment be without their royal links? Here he is with Queenie. He was knighted in the New Year's honours list, and he very much favourite of the royal family, and many of the royal family have been on Necker, and I'll talk about that as well. He was knighted by Charles, who was then Prince of Wales, in March 2000, and it was for services to entrepreneurship, and he was knighted at Buckingham Palace. It almost goes without saying, once you get to the point of these people, you are often royal suck-ups, and he was no exception at all. He was quite close to Princess Diana. In fact, she was one of the first famous faces spotted on Necker in 1990. She was with William and Harry and her mother and her two older sisters and their children. Sarah Ferguson, he's had a long-standing friendship with dodgy Sarah Ferguson, obviously former wife of dodgy Andrew. Lots of stuff have come out now about Sarah Ferguson taking a ton of money from Epstein because she's just an absolute wastrel who didn't actually want to do any serious work but spent constantly. Anyway, Sarah Ferguson has been a very long-term friend of Richard Branson, and in fact recently when she escaped the UK and a lot of the headlines that were coming out about her, it was said that she was going off to Branson's Necker Island, but that hasn't been confirmed. And then it was said that she was going into rehab. And also Kate Middleton, he appeared to know Kate Middleton long before she became Princess Kate, because she was a close friend of his daughter, Holly Branson, and she took holidays on Necker. And also, but they did much more together. The thing is, a lot of people don't realize about Kate Middleton was that she didn't come from the same background as like Prince William and that, right? She didn't come from that kind of society background, but because her mum and dad had like a party planning business, but they were she was essentially a social climber. She knew where she wanted to be. It was not for Kate to be married to John who delivers the milk, right? That was not what her or her mum wanted. And it was even said that she attended St. Andrews University because that was where William was going, and she was absolutely intent on getting him. Anyway, she's always mixed in those kind of society places. But one of the things that she did was she essentially brokered this deal between Richard Branson and her parents' party planning company. That was actually once we entered the 2000s. And the party planning company, Party Pieces, ended up being a Virgin Experience, and that was said to have been brokered by Kate Middleton. And then there was Blue Nomad, just like Meghan, just like Sarah Ferguson. In fact, I'd go so far as to say, excuse me, let me have some water. I'd go so far as to say Diana was the only one who didn't have an eye on how to make money out of the firm. And but all the others, Meghan Markle, Sarah Ferguson, Kate Middleton, pretty much all cut from a similar cloth. And there was also, I don't know if you remember it, there was also this infamous image of Prince Harry. He attended Sam Branson's 27th birthday party on Necker, and in 2012, and a friend then posted an image of Harry like out for the count on the beach. He was absolutely drunk. He was off his face. And that was around 2012. That didn't stop Harry. He then returned 3 years later to Necker because it was party place. He loved it. But like David Beckham, like Stephen Fry, like Richard Attenborough, Branson is on his knees for royalty. You will never find me doing stuff like that. These people are such sycophants. They're horrendous. They prop up royalty and leave the rest of us to pay for them as they bugger off around the world and do everything they can to minimize their taxes. And I saw a video where Richard Branson was talking about the royals and about Harry and William. And he actually said, and I I think I threw up a little bit in my mouth when I heard him say it. He said that Harry and William were born to lead. This very much is about kind of like, putting the oiks and the plebs in their place, that these people are above us. In fact, I go so far as say neither Harry or William have leadership material, our leadership quality, not at all. But that gives you a perfect example of Branson sucking up on a constant basis to these people. And a lot of his relationships have been around kind of like not necessarily the central, not necessarily Charles or the Queen, but the people who married in to the royal family and the grandchildren as one example. And his children are like him. I'm going to talk about his foundation in a minute, but his children are like him, right? And what they did, Holly and Sam, they formed a foundation, another sodding foundation with Princess Beatrice. So that's Andrew and Sarah Ferguson's daughter. And the foundation is the Big Change Charitable Trust. And it's said to be a UK-based social impact accelerator. And the idea is that to drive long-term systemic change in education, mental health, and social care. And we are told that over the last 13 years, it supported numerous projects, impacted nearly 8 million young people and 200,000 teachers. But it's really easy to say all of that. And we also know that foundations tend to benefit the people who have formed them more than the people it's intended for. And I have a lot of problems with the Big Change Charitable Trust, and not least because we are now learning, of course, about Beatrice and the problems with Beatrice also being like her parents, money hungry and greedy, and not having too much of an issue of the kind of people that she will socialize with in order to get that. But yeah, the Branson children, just like their father, they've been taught well. This is how you hide money, kids. This is how you do it. And it has to be said that his image has been hugely helped by his multiple media appearances in the role of businessman we all like. I mean, it's true, isn't it? He appeared in Shark Tank, which is the US equivalent of like the Dragon's Den. He appeared in that and he became the wealthiest shark to appear on the show. He appeared in like Baywatch. And so he's done stuff like that, and it makes him appear very down to earth and not at all kind of business-like. And people love that, and people are so easily fooled. And when I say people, that might not be you, but people are so easily fooled. Yes, Mary, I think we can safely say that the two Mountbatten Windsor sisters have benefited greatly from their positions. And anyway, so I want to talk about charity, and I want to talk about Branson's foundation. So he's done loads of charitable concerns. They all do, don't they? And he always talks about humanitarianism and humanitarian aid and rah, 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 blah, blah, blah. And Branson, so what he did as one example, in 2019, he helped to organize an international benefit concert for Venezuela, Live Aid Live. The idea was to bring worldwide attention to the humanitarian crisis there. The concert took place in February. And they've done loads of different things. As I say, they had discussed this whole idea of the elders. They're very interested in Africa, these people, for the same reason that I believe Bono is interested in Africa, and that is they are essentially representing their globalist handlers, their globalist associates. They see that Africa is very rich in, well, all manner of natural resources, including minerals, including gold, including diamonds, as one example. But the reality is that these sodding foundations are more problematic than they are of any use. So he formed Virgin Unite. We were told it was an independent non-profit foundation of the Virgin Group. It was established by Branson in 2004. And the idea was, this is their press bump, to tackle tough social and environmental challenges. Now, it's very important to understand that these people are not stupid. They understand that what tugs at our heartstrings is when we hear that people can't afford to eat, people can't afford to live, but we are less impressed by environmental causes like climate change, ocean preservation, all that sort of stuff. Well, that's what Virgin Unite actually also does, a huge amount of it. It essentially works as this hub to launch new organizations that we are told address complex global issues. It doesn't operate as a traditional grant-making charity, by the way. Um, He's done loads of so-called charitable work, and I'm going to come back to the foundation, but I also need to mention this, and that is his involvement with missing children. And in 1998, the board of directors of the United States National Center for Missing and Exploited Children, they approved the creation of the International Center for Missing Children. And Branson, with his mother Eve, were on the board of directors of the International Center for Missing and Exploited Children. And Branson became a founding sponsor of the International Center. And the missing the center itself, originally based in America, but now in 100 countries. They've gone all over the place. And lots of question marks about that, run by Ernie Allen. And I remember when Madeleine McCann went missing, Jerry McCann went to America to talk to Ernie Allen. And I was in no doubt whatsoever that Jerry McCann wanted to do something quite similar in the UK. He wanted a kind of similar missing children sort of unit in the UK. Anyway, Richard Branson was very much involved in that. And there's always question marks over organizations like this. I have to be careful what I'm saying because, as I said at the start, I don't want to allege any criminality, but I will leave you to join your own dots about involvement in things like this, because I think it's very interesting. And he also launched Virgin Startup, which was kind of like, this whole idea was startup for entrepreneurs in the UK. But actually what he got was a load of great positive publicity about it. And he actually only ended up giving £600,000 into 100 businesses. So again, going back to how he distributed money amongst Virgin staff is a similar thing. And they don't always tell you the amounts involved, but this was only just over £500,000 that he put into 100 businesses, into 100 startups. It's not a huge amount of money. And but yet he was seen as somebody who was very interested in English and British entrepreneurs. And he also is co-founder of the thing called the B Team, which is again another global non-profit organization founded in 2013. And it was him, a group of business leaders, all the same stuff that they were involved in. They had a number of focus areas such as climate action and ironically responsible tax practices. So I want to talk about that. But first of all, rich people, we've said this before, rich people set up foundations primarily to minimize taxes. That is the reality. They can minimize income tax, capital gains, and estate. They also get to maintain control over the assets while acting like these big, beneficent individuals. Oh, look at that. That man is such a philanthropist. He's incredible, all that kind of stuff. And what it does is it's brilliant PR. It builds this lasting, positive public legacy. And they offer a win-win for people like Richard Branson, because, as I say, significant tax advantages, deductions in income tax, capital gains, inheritance, and donors can also retain control over the strategies and how money is spent, obviously within the bounds of charity law. They can direct funds that to causes that align with their own personal beliefs. Many people far more knowledgeable than myself about foundations say that foundations are really problematic because what they also seek to do is kind of avoid any democracy, because it's these individuals, and these individuals have decided this is the way they want the world to look. And so they form these foundations, and then they set about bringing in lots of money from their rich mates as well as from the general public to spend how they think the world should be. So it's never as generous as it appears. And should one individual really have that much power to advance their own idea of how society should be? No. And that's what all philanthropists do, whether it's George Soros, whether it's Bill Gates, whether it's Richard Branson. And the thing about Richard Branson is, in terms of his worldview, a bit difficult to know what his worldview is, because this is a man who has flip-flopped all his life politically. Sometimes he's on the right, sometimes he's on the left, really whichever one he can do business with. But the reality is that the taxpayer contributes to philanthropy by the fact that foundation is tax-free. We're picking up the costs. That's what happens. And there's so much wrong with it, because where does this money go? And there was a brilliant article, and I can't remember where it was. I think it might have been in The Guardian. It was back in 2020. It was written by a journalist called Paul Vallely, and I took some of the quotes from it because it was really clever. It was a brilliant breakdown about foundations, and what Paul Vallely noted was one of the main questions was, where does the money go? Because they say big things, don't they? We're like, we're here and we're going to rectify the problems in society and we're going to balance it up, make it more of an equal world. But where does the money really go? And what Paul Vallely discovered was that the money often goes back to people like themselves or themselves. And I'll give you an example. He used an example of donations in education in the UK in 2019. And what happened was the donations, 4.79 billion donated to education in 2019 in the UK. That sounds great, incredible. Put that in your local secondary comprehensive, your local primary school, as if what it was actually discovered was that half of this amount went to just two universities, Oxford and Cambridge. And we talked about that before. And Oxford and Cambridge, often known as a combination of Oxbridge, and generally people who are running our world have gone through that. Even people come in from outside the country to go through Oxford and Cambridge. But that's where the money goes back to. Joanne said it's just laundering. And the reality is the foundations often benefit them and their elite parasitical causes. That is the reality. A lot of elite philanthropy is about elite causes. Rather than making the world a better place, it largely reinforces the world as it is. And philanthropy very often favors the rich and no one holds them to account. So they are busy making sure that private education, of which they send their children to, is receiving money from their foundations. This is different foundations. I'm not saying this about Virgin Unite, but this is generally how all foundations work. And all you have to do is look at it. There are hundreds of thousands of foundations in this world, but have we eliminated poverty? No. So that's all you need to know, really. They are so busy with interfering with altering society and public policy. And it just, I find it really quite detestable. When I discovered that the vast majority of those billions that were donated in 2019 went to private institutions, it's just a big club sail away. It's absolutely, Stephen, most BBC people are Oxbridge. Absolutely. Reality. Absolutely the reality. But the truth is, what we want from people like Branson is not to set up these fancy foundations. We just want them to pay their taxes fairly and squarely. That's all we want. But they get this incredible tax relief. And obviously, the higher the amount of money that is given to a foundation, the more tax relief they get. And, you know, the only records I could find really relating to foundations and tax breaks go back to 2012. And it was in the UK alone, it was estimated that the total cost to the state of the tax breaks to donors in 2012 was estimated by the British Treasury to be £3.64 billion. So that's money that we've lost, right? But it's down to us, the taxpayers who are earning a fraction of what the Bransons of this world are earning, to hold up the rest of the country, our infrastructure. So, the mega rich get these incredible tax breaks. And money could be put to better use if it was actually collected in taxes. It really could. But that's not what they're interested in, because people like Richard Branson, they have these foundations because they can decide what to do with their money while also creating this incredible air that they are wonderful, giving humanitarian people. But they're not. They're absolutely not. And it's just ridiculous. Branson spent plenty of time excuse me, at WEF, at Davos, right? So amongst these kind of business parasites, and they love to talk about philanthropy. And one of the big conversations that they've had in Davos was how the world could prevent a social backlash rising from the growth of inequality. And one of them, actually, Dutch economic historian Rutger Bregman, actually talked about, the answer was very simple: just stop talking about philanthropy and start talking about taxes. Taxes, taxes, taxes. All the rest is BS, in my opinion. That was probably the most sensible thing that's ever been said at WEF. But Richard Branson and his ilk, other billionaire business owners, they are very interested in philanthropy for all the reasons that I've just outlined. And frankly, it makes me sick to the core. But it was something that happened between Branson and Epstein and a donation for Virgin Unite that seemed to end the relationship between Richard Branson and Jeffrey Epstein. And Richard Branson appears on multiple occasions in the Epstein files, which were obviously recently released by America's Department of Justice. And Richard Branson's team have done everything they humanly can. They've gone above and beyond the call of duty to play down the relationship that Richard Branson had with Jeffrey Epstein. But the reality is they had a fairly close, even intimate relationship over a period of years. Their islands, as I say, were only about 20 minutes apart. They island hopped, and Epstein hopped to see Richard Branson on Necker with what actually appears to be trafficked victims. So the publication Paste has done what I consider the best timeline of Branson and Epstein's friendship and what it may have entailed. So I'm going to work from that, and I'll put a link in the description so you can read the article. It's an extensive article, and I'm going to draw on it. But I think that they have done the very best job of following a timeline. And what they ended up doing was sending correspondence backwards and forwards to Richard Branson's spokespeople at Virgin, his Virgin team. And Richard Branson features at length in the Epstein files. There are 798 pings of his last name alone in Epstein's emails. So I feature 4 times, and I'm a journalist who's covered this stuff extensively, but to get 798 pings is quite extensive, just to give you some context. And there is so much evidence of Epstein's connection, whether criminal or not. And let's be very clear that just because people are in the Epstein files, it doesn't mean that they're criminals. And I am not alleging that, just to say that again. But I think it's so interesting because Epstein felt the need, obviously, to document so much. And also, why did people allow him to document so much? Here he is with his dear friend, Richard. And one of the things that the Branson people have tried to make people believe is that their first meeting was not until 2013, and that's when it first started. So the official narrative from the Branson people is, and I'm going to read you a direct quote: any contact Richard and Joan Branson had with Epstein took place on only a few occasions more than 12 years ago and was limited to group or business settings. That's what the representative said in a statement. Richard believes that Epstein's actions were abhorrent and supports the right to justice for his many victims. So what was interesting was that Paste then started to go, well, hold on a second, some of these dates aren't quite adding up. So they went backwards and forwards. And each time they went backwards and forwards with Richard Branson's people were forced to admit further dates that Branson and Epstein were in contact. But they wanted to start, like his tax affairs, he wants to pay the bare minimum. He wants to tell you the bare minimum about his involvement with Epstein, and for very good reason, I would suggest. And the reason that I say trafficked victims went with Epstein to Richard Branson's island is because I think we can follow that through. So here we go. Let's do it. So what happened was Paste contact the Branson spokesperson, and then they got all these standard responses, and then they started to unpack the story, and they were like, something's really wrong. There are discrepancies between Branson's official statements and the reality of what really happened. And once you start to review the Epstein files, you realize that Branson's people really were chancing their arm, because all you have to do is read the files and realize that it really wasn't as minimal as they tried to make it out. And it's a really interesting timeline that goes on, because what we know is that the statements that were coming from Virgin, 3 separate statements, each including more information than the last, the inconsistencies still remained. And that takes some real good due diligence, some good journalistic work, which is why I'm more than happy to absolutely recommend that article. It's a great piece. As I said, they go into great detail, and it's really, really good stuff. And I'm going to start to read through some of it. And so what they want us to believe is that Epstein and Branson really only kind of came together around April 2013. What's bunkum? It's bunkum because if you go to the Epstein files, the first mention of a meeting between Epstein and Branson is actually in 2006. It's already 7 years difference, right? And none of the statements, by the way, supplied by the Virgin Group to Pace made any mention of an official in-person meeting between Epstein and Branson prior to April 2013. But in these emails, we see Epstein himself apparently discussing one such meeting, as I say, as early as January 2006, so 7 years prior to the first meeting that Branson's spokespeople want people to believe. And there's loads of interesting stuff. They have emails between them where they talk about this kind of elder statesman council of the world that they want to do. Imagine that. Branson and Epstein involved in an elder statesman council of the world. Didn't it give you the creeps? Because they both fancied themselves as overlords. And Epstein wrote to a Harvard psychologist, Howard Gardner, who actually came up with the 7 intelligences, a brilliant psychologist. And what he realized was that intelligence was so much more than just kind of like the IQ tests, and that there were a number of different intelligences. So Epstein did surround himself with quite brilliant people often, but in an email to Howard Gardner, he said on January 10th, 2006, he said, "Sorry, I missed you. I met with Richard Branson, who is working on creating what he terms an elder statesman council of the world, and asked who I thought might be appropriate." So that was 2006, where Epstein says he met with Branson, and yet Branson's people want us to believe their first meeting was 2013. So problematic straight away. Then there was a breakfast that took place in 2011, and neither the first or second statements from Virgin to Pace referenced any meetings prior to 2013. So there was this breakfast meeting where they discussed their cultivating of their friendship, and there are other references involving Branson's staff and Epstein arranging to pick people up on Necker Island in January 2011. And it's interesting because there's also mention of Peter Mandelson, who was arrested this week amid fears that he was a flight risk. And the Speaker of the House claimed that Mandelson would flee to the British Virgin Islands. Where? To his mate's Necker Island, perhaps. That's why he was arrested. So that is interesting. But in January 2011, he wrote to Mandelson, said he had breakfast. This is Epstein. He'd said he'd had breakfast with Richard Branson, who is also a big fan of Africa. Quotes. And Mandelson replied, "Let's go for it." What's that? Deplete the natural resources? Is that the idea? And later that day, Epstein then emailed Branson himself with this kind of vaguely weird sounding message under the subject heading, "A treat." And it said, "Dear neighbor, thanks for your hospitality this morning." So that's 2011. But Virgin wanted us to believe they didn't meet until 2013. This is 2011. And Epstein clearly says to Branson, "Thank you for your hospitality this morning, though it's a little late to find new friends. I hope you and I can also meet that challenge." And Branson replied with, "Dear Jeffrey, I am sure we will. All the best, Richard." So what went on there? What was that breakfast meeting about? When it appears that Branson and Epstein had this friendly breakfast, went rather well, frankly, and so well that Epstein then felt the need to contact his mate Peter Mandelson about it. But Branson and his people will have it, as I say, that their first official meeting was 2013. So somebody's telling porkies. Why would they be telling porkies? And really, throughout that time, there was ongoing contact between Epstein and Branson, largely initiated by Epstein, it has to say. It was very clear that Epstein wanted to be close to Branson. So in 2011, after that kind of January breakfast meeting, for the next 2 or so months, Epstein contacted Branson frequently about his desire to get together. Branson was never actually available. He was moving around a lot. Epstein had told Branson that he'd be in New York in mid-January of 2011 and Paris later if Branson was around. Branson was not due to a leg injury. And what was interesting was despite they talk very much in codes. If you read those emails between them, it's codes, right? It's coded words. And despite the apparent innocence of this exchange, Epstein goes so far as to reassure Branson that at the bottom of my emails, I have always added a copyright notice because it gives great pause to publications that might get hold of them someday. Now, this is interesting because they wrote these emails in a guarded way because they suspected one day they would be investigated, that those emails may well fall into the hands of the FBI, the police, and then the public. So they even with as much as is being shown in those emails, Epstein was absolutely aware that he was on thin ice. No doubt about it. It is coded 100%, Michael, Simon. It is. Yes, John, cunning stuff. Absolutely. And it's also interesting stuff that Epstein, on January the 14th, 2011, Epstein had asked Branson if he wanted some company on Necker. Branson responded, "Dear Jeffrey, sorry, would love to have done, but had to go to Europe in the end. Love to the girls. Best Richard." And these are the girls that Richard Branson had met. And Epstein told Branson that he'd be in Paris and Branson couldn't go because sadly he was in San Diego. And then in February 2011, Epstein wrote to Branson saying, "Fun people on the island, both types. Are you here?" Now, when he says both types, does he mean male and female? Is that what he means? Is there something else that I'm missing there? But then Branson responded, very sadly, not. And the Virgin Group maintains that Branson did not understand what Epstein meant by that email. And but come on now. And again, have to repeat this, nothing apparently criminal about their correspondence, because it's really important. It's worth emphasizing that none of these emails indicate wrongdoing on Branson's part. And I say that not least because I don't want to be sued. They will be judged by the court of public opinion. But the reality is Branson wasn't as ignorant as he claimed, right? He absolutely wasn't. There are multiple phrases throughout these emails that cast some doubt upon Branson's insistence that he was utterly ignorant of Epstein's doings. The language between them, highly questionable. It was as if Branson knew what Epstein was about. And in fact, he even offered him PR advice, right? So they're trying to downplay it. And it's not good. It's really not good. And so the first meeting that they've been prepared to admit was a business meeting in 2013 on April the 14th, 2013, the so-called first business meeting on Necker Island. There were 4 confirmed in-person meetings between Epstein and Branson, which occurred in 2013, 1 in April, 1 in September, and 2 in November. And the reality is Epstein's emails do not support the position of Richard Branson and his spokesperson. And the release files indicate that the meeting itself may not have been particularly brief. In fact, Epstein sent an email to one of his victims the following day on April 15th, which said, discusses how he spent the day yesterday with Branson on his island. Well, spending the day yesterday with Branson on his island is not a brief business meeting, right? So they've done everything they humanly can to try and play this all down. And additionally, Epstein emailed Bill Gates' assistant, Nikolic, around 7 p.m. on April the 14th, shortly after leaving Branson's island and this so-called brief business meeting, to talk about the great fun, in quotes, that he'd had on Necker. And that's an unusual phrase to use when you're referencing a business meeting, right? I very seldom say, "Oh, yeah, I had great fun at that business meeting." That's generally not what it's about. He also attached a photo, although that photo itself is not visible in the files. I couldn't find it. And the next day, he invited Branson to come visit. "No question is silly. We can spend quiet time." This is not a business associate. You don't arrange fun times, quiet times, love to the girls with a business associate, unless it's a certain type of business associate. This absolutely suggests that this was personal. They probably were doing business as well, but this definitely suggests that it was personal. There were also, crucially, 2 other guests on this day, both of whom remain fully redacted in all emails, yet Paste managed to discover that these were 2 Russian girls. So, what was interesting here was that Branson had approved these 2 Russian girls coming because there was correspondence between Epstein and Branson's assistants about arranging this. There was this email exchange that Jeffrey will come along with Dean Gregg and Redacted, which was the 2 Russian girls' names. And it said they don't have UK visas. And that seems more like a social event than a business one, frankly. And then on April the 16th, another exchange between the assistants inviting Branson to come to Epstein's Island. So this was very rapid that their relationship was developing. And the 2 seemingly had a phone call, and it wasn't recorded in the files. But one of the assistants had responded, per our phone call, Richard is hosting guests on NECA this week, so more than likely won't be able to make it over to see Jeffrey. However, if anything changes, I will send you an email. And continued in that vein, really. And what was interesting was, so the DOJ files, the idea was that they were going to redact the name of Epstein's victims. And yet actually they failed to a lot of the time. They redacted the names of businessmen, but they failed to redact the name oftentimes of victims. And what Pace were able to trace, and I followed it through, and brilliant work, what they were able to trace were these were 2 of the victims. So these 2 Russian girls who had been taken over to NECA and whose Epstein's assistant had told Branson's assistant, and Branson's assistant then forwarded the email to Branson. Branson knew these girls were coming. Now, he may say, I had no idea they were trafficked, right? But the information was made available that these were 2 Russian girls without visas. So I think that was interesting. They only redacted Trump's friends' names, says John Rambo. Indeed. And then between May to July 2013, there was just further contact between them. Epstein invited Branson to his island 3 times. On May the 14th, Epstein asked Branson if he was coming to the Caribbean anytime soon. Branson said he's sadly traveling almost nonstop for the next 6 weeks. Foolish, he said. Epstein replied, oh, shame. They were close. They were close. This continued throughout 2013. And the second business meeting on NECA is when the very famous harem quote came out recently. This was said to be the second business meeting. This was September the 10th, 2013 on Necker Island. And at the second business meeting, we were told that Epstein visited Richard and Joan with his family. He said that Epstein would drop them off in his helicopter, and Epstein arrived with 3 members of his team, who he later called his harem. The 3 adult women did not attend the meeting and instead spent time socializing with the sports team on the island. Of course, the most important aspect of this, I think, the reference to it, is the 3 members of Epstein's team, who he later called his harem. And why? And here's where it got interesting, because the correspondence between the assistants were talking about the nationality and ethnicities of these 3 women. Who does that for a business meeting? Or if they're just hopping along with Epstein to go and play with Richard Branson's sports team, right? But they actually talked about how it's all redacted. These names are Russian, Ukrainian, and Swiss. Why would you feel the need to inform Richard Branson's assistant of the ethnicity and the origins of these women if they're going there nothing to do with a meeting? It's weird. It goes without saying it's unusual someone to refer to their team members by their places of origin. I don't do it. Do you do it? Do you say, I've got a Russian, Croatian, Ukrainian girl coming with me? And it wouldn't be that sort of language anyway. It's weird. It's weird. It goes far deeper than we ever know. You're welcome, Mark. Absolutely welcome. And the reality is, speculation is not necessary. It's all there. The 3 women that went with Epstein were trafficking victims. They were Daniel Syed, who was a modeling scout and trafficker for Epstein, first introduced one of the girls to Epstein on July the 9th, 2013, and she ended up going to Branson's Island in September, just 2 months later. And the reason that Pace were able to track this, as I say, was that the names of the victims were not redacted. Yeah, were unredacted. And this girl who was trafficked was flown to and from the island to Paris, to Epstein's place, Paris, where he's got a place and he wanted Richard Branson to join him. Now, I am not alleging that Richard Branson knew anything about these trafficked females, but what I am saying, it appears absolutely categorically that the 3 females who Epstein was taken to Richard Branson's island were trafficked victims. They weren't minors, but they were trafficked victims. So as far as I'm concerned, anything that happened to them was not consensual, and so was rape. Obviously, they were victims of Epstein. They were present at the social meetings with Branson. And why? And what was interesting was after that meeting in September with the 3 girls that went along, Richard wrote to Jeffrey Epstein saying, it was really nice seeing you yesterday. The boys in water sports can't stop speaking about it. Anytime you're in the area, would love to see you, as long as you bring your harem. And so that's sexual language. You don't use that word if you're taking your mum and your gran along, right? It would appear that Branson knew these 3 females were associated sexually with Epstein. That's what it would appear. Anyway, there's so many of them. There's so many exchanges. So for Branson's team to minimize it and deny it and say the first time that they met was 2013 is disgusting. It's bunkum, and it's really makes it very suspicious, because if you've got nothing to hide, why hide it? Right? Really worrying, troubling stuff. But his team denied knowing full facts, and but his team came out and said, we weren't really aware of what had happened with Epstein, but the reality is quite different, because Branson was friends with Epstein, and Epstein was bringing girls to his island after Epstein had been under investigation for sexually abusing a 14-year-old since 2005. Federal officials had identified 36 girls, many of whom were minors, that Epstein had raped. Epstein had pled guilty to procuring for prostitution a girl below the age of 18 in 2008. And yet he and Branson were tight after that. This was all in the public domain. And besides, why was Branson offering PR advice, which he did? He offered PR advice to Jeffrey Epstein. Anyway, there were more potential get-togethers in October. And I think where things started to get a bit funky was in November of 2013. Now, on Necker Island, they have this thing called the Necker Cup. And it's a tennis program mentioned in emails with Epstein. And it's an event co-founded by Branson, hosted on his island. And Epstein attended the Necker Cup in November 2013. And it was kind of organized and attended by around 150 people. And Epstein mentioned to Branson that he was considering selling his island, and he asked if Richard would be interested. And then there was some kind of fallout, right? And it would appear that it was to do with donation. So what happened was Epstein had gone to the Necker Cup. They seemed perfectly fine in November. And then the Bransons have claimed in later correspondence that Epstein was going to give them money for the Virgin Unite Foundation. And then they did due diligence. Well, only then they did due diligence, and they decided not to accept money for Virgin Unite. However, they did then redirect Epstein's money to another charitable concern that Branson was promoting. So they didn't want his name attached to Virgin Unite, but they were quite happy to shuffle it off elsewhere. Mel's wants a boycott of anything Virgin. So they fell out then. But even when, again, Pace have done a brilliant job, because they've caught out Branson's spokespeople, because Branson's spokespeople are like, yeah, Rich didn't want to accept money, but it's like, but he redirected the money, right? And also they were saying that they'd kind of fallen out late October, but Epstein was at the Necker Cup in November. So it doesn't make any sense. A lot of it doesn't make any sense. And there was other stuff around that time to do with these three girls and Branson's Island. And one of them was an email that after Epstein had attended the Necker Cup on November the 14th, he emailed Branson his appreciation. By this point, according to the spokespeople, they're not supposed to be barely speaking because Branson hasn't accepted his money. But he emailed Branson and he said that he invited him along with to join him and Woody Allen, although he wrote Woody Alien, Woody Allen over Christmas. And Branson replied and thanked Epstein for his incredible generosity. Let's be clear who Woody Allen is. Woody Allen is another pervert predator. Woody Allen is a man who got together with, he was with Mia Farrow, the actor who adopted multiple children, and one of the children that she adopted, Woody Allen, began taking pictures of when she was very young and eventually got together with. A very coercive, problematic relationship. And Epstein is there inviting Branson to have Christmas with him and Woody Allen. And by that point, 2013, everybody knew everything that they needed to know about Woody Allen. So maybe it's just birds of a feather flocking together. Maybe that's what it is. Anyway, they fell out after Epstein had offered that 50K charity donation. And the team are like, yes, I'm sorry, Simon, I'm just delivering the details here. He married his stepdaughter, Drum. That's exactly what it is. He's disgusting, absolutely disgusting. But Epstein was inviting Branson to spend Christmas with them. So that kind of tells you all you need to know. And just to say, I've just been reminded of the place that when Branson's team said, no, we can't accept the money for Virgin Unite. And so what they did was they suggested this organization called Wild Aid. And although it's not related to Branson, he doesn't have his fingers in that particular pie. He did actually serve as an ambassador for it for a period of time. So if the reason Branson distanced himself from Epstein was due diligence, it's absolutely unclear why Branson's team would have recommended Epstein donate to anything Branson was even remotely connected to. This was about saving face. And what we were told was that they decided not to meet, or that Branson decided not to meet or speak to him again, but he took his money for another organization. Sounds kind of immoral to me. But you know, Virgin Group said the due diligence was conducted and that was it. And the final meeting turned out to be a lunch at the end of November. This was also not included in the Virgin spokesperson's initial response to Pace. See how fast and loose they are playing with the truth. It's just awful. And apparently it was a visit to Necker to again talk about the potential of Branson buying Epstein's island. And that was it. So, but nonetheless, then the relationship petered out. But very clearly, this was not a brief relationship. This went on for, well, I don't know what, 7 years? And really bad stuff. That's right, Drum. Due diligence for themselves. Absolutely. And Kerry said, good job. They took the fun out of fundamentalism, got you. And so then Epstein and Branson, their relationship petered out and that was it. And again, to be clear, there does not seem to be any information in the newly released email suggesting that Richard Branson committed any criminal acts. I have to say that, of course, because I'd be stupid not to. So let's talk a little bit about wealth and money. Huge amount of money. He was 9th in the Sunday Times rich list in 2006 of the wealthiest people or families in the UK. He was worth slightly more than 3 billion then. That was 2006. He did at one stage slip down the annual Sunday Times rich list, and that was because his satellite launch company Virgin Orbit went bankrupt. But for the most part, I think the most recent Sunday Times rich list had him at 4.2 billion, placed him at 44th on the list. And, you know, the thing about Richard Branson is, like with foundations, he says great things on the surface, but what do they really amount to? These people love doing a double dance with us. One of the things that he's talked about is how the world's wealthiest deserve heavy taxes. And this is a direct quote from him: capitalism, which in its purest form is entrepreneurialism, entrepreneurism, even among the poorest of the poor, does work. But those who make money from it should put back into society, not just sit on it as if they're hatching eggs. Oh, again, talks a great and wonderful talk, because he is one of the kind of growing parasites like the Bill Gates. They love to talk about how we need more equity, more equality in our world. And yeah, they're doing everything they humanly can to hold on to their money and create all these organizations that will either help people like them, which eventually will help them anyway, or help themselves. And he talked about how we have to do everything we can to try and lift the vast majority of people up and all this stuff. Yet, actually, let's remove that. Yet, this is a man who has a history, as we've seen, of tax dodging, right? We saw right at the start where he was lying that he was exporting records when he was selling them in the UK so that he could get away without paying certain taxes. And so one would say, oh, so has he changed? Because the thing about Richard Branson that we must not forget is he makes a big thing about being a patriot, right? Look at him in his Union Jack suit, but only when it suits him. It's important to note that. And according to biographer Tom Bauer, Branson has not liked paying taxes since he was 19 years old. And Bauer has written a biography about him, or autobiography, right? I never remember whether it's biography. Yeah. And he says that Branson has been absolutely obsessed with money since he was at least 19 years old. Well, I would argue that it was at least 16 years old. And because there was that issue, as I say, that we referred to earlier, but there's so much more. And going back to when he sold Virgin Music, right? Virgin Records. So that was 1973. And going back to Virgin Music. So how the first release was Mike Oldfield, Tubular Bells, remember The Exorcist, and even Mike Oldfield said that we've sold 16 million records, a lot of records, right? That was the first release for Virgin Records. What did they do? They registered so what happened was that the profits from Tubular Bells were paid into a company registered by Branson's trustees, and they did it in the tax-free Channel Islands. And the album, of course, made Branson a millionaire. And ever since, Branson has paid his advisors to construct this incredible Virgin empire. And it is through this bewildering series of offshore companies that is extremely difficult to penetrate. But what we do know unquestionably is that through it, he does everything he can to pay an absolute minimal amount of British taxes. And then when he sold Virgin Music to EMI, and remember, he said, I have to do this. It breaks. And he's like, it breaks my heart. This is my first big business, but I have to do it to keep Virgin Atlantic going and blah, blah, blah. What we didn't know at the time was in order for him to avoid paying 84 million in taxes on the profits that were obviously made by selling Virgin Music to EMI, the sale was directed again through Branson Trust in the Channel Islands. So this is a continuing pattern for him while he's out there saying that capitalism and rich people must do more for the world's poor. But you're not, though. You're not. And there's been so much found out about him, and he's done things like his advisors anticipated that there would come a point when UK, tax office would realize what he was doing and all the various loopholes that he'd managed to find. And what they ended up doing was Virgin would hold their board meetings in Necker, the Channel Islands, and Switzerland. And the purpose was to show that Britain was not Virgin's headquarters and that the firm's management was making all its decisions offshore. That was the aim. And he did things like he transferred ownership of his Oxford home to his children. So he used to have a base in Kidlington, and he ended up transferring that to his children. And so now what we're told is that Branson now has no homes in Britain, but a large number of homes scattered across the globe. He travels in his private jet from one continent to another. And it's very, very hard for tax investigators to try and identify the actual location where he is permanently resident. It's very, very hard. And yet he portrays himself as this devoted patriot. And also Virgin have Virgin have hugely traded off of Britain off of the Union flag, and they've been trumpeted as like the UK's. He has been trumpeted as the UK's most popular entrepreneur, and he's associated himself with national successes such as the London Olympics, which was quite a sight. But he's now he's permanently on Necker. He says that it was a health decision, not a business decision. He says he has enough money that he wouldn't have to escape there for taxes. Well, you spent your whole life doing everything you can to avoid taxes. Don't give us that. He has such a gaslighting nerve to talk about how people should pay their share of tax. These people are absolutely shameless. I wouldn't have the nerve, right, to be doing what he's doing and then come out and say rich people need to pay more fair taxes. It takes a lot. Yeah, Peter, these people that bang on about climate change all have private jets, and he bangs on about climate change a lot. And what happened was in 2013, he admitted in a blog that he was a tax exile and actually had been already for 7 years. So people were like, what? And so there were these petitions that went up and people wanted his knighthood to be revoked. If I remember correctly, why would that happen? Because I think the Queen was in the Panama Papers, which again was offshore tax dealings. And at the time, the Shadow Chancellor of the Exchequer was John McDonnell, probably one of the last actually honourable people to enter Parliament. And he called for well, essentially Branson's knighthood to be revoked. It never was, of course. There was a huge petition. Branson has always made much play of his British origins for marketing purposes. He's done loads of things. As I say, he's done the Olympics, the Queen's Diamond Jubilee. When Margaret Thatcher criticised British Airways for dropping the Union flag from its tail fins, Branson immediately commissioned his planes to be decorated with flying ladies, trailing the British flag. That's what he did. So he very opportunistic, absolutely opportunistic. And I think my friend Monkey sent me a great quote about how this morning about how Richard Branson, if you're asked to do something, just say yes. And, you know, I'm paraphrasing, but don't miss that opportunity, do it and you'll learn it anyway. And that kind of sums him up to a huge degree. But the thing is about all of this money, all came back to haunt him during C19, because obviously you can't be a globalist shill without pushing C19, and he pushed it to the fullest. Here he is getting my COVID-19 vaccine. And then he wanted a taxpayer bailout. Do you remember that? So he talked about how he and his wonderful wife Joan and I received the vaccine on Virgin Gorda. The jab is absolutely painless. The vaccine is absolutely safe, he said. How did you know that, Richard? Was it one of your dodgy healthcare companies that told you that? And really problematic, of course. And, you know, so what happened was that he was then in April 2020, during the height of C19, he sought a commercial loan for Virgin Atlantic from the UK government. They always say the UK government, but it's us, the taxpayers. It's my money. He sought a loan from me, and it was believed to be around £500 million sterling. And he said he wanted to secure this commercial loan, not a grant, to keep Virgin Atlantic afloat. He offered Necker as collateral, but big backlash because people were like, this man has been avoiding paying tax for years and now he wants a bailout. And it was just absolutely huge. He also, because he had a residence in Australia, he's got a house in Australia, he also sought a loan from the Australian government for Virgin Australia. He wanted 715 million from the Australian government. Anyway, the UK government rejected the initial bailout request. Virgin Atlantic eventually secured a 1.2 billion rescue deal, which apparently included some money from the Virgin Group. And in 2023, Richard Branson said that COVID-19 had cost his Virgin Empire roughly 1.5 billion. And what? It cost many people their lives and their livelihoods, and they weren't so greedy as to want. And these bailouts, they're not always as straightforward as it seems, even though he's like, I'm offering that up as collateral. They're never that straightforward, but a huge amount of criticism about it. And many people quite rightly saying, why isn't he using his own money? I mean, he did to a certain degree, but why isn't he to keep his airlines afloat? Now, the other side of that argument is he's employing British staff. But nonetheless, COVID-19, as we discovered, was really, amongst other agendas, but it was also about a transference of wealth. So it was also really problematic. And Branson ended up issuing this letter saying, comments about my home. Me and Joan, we moved to Necker for health reasons. I didn't move to avoid tax. Yeah, but don't look like it, mate, because you've got a history of doing that. A wrong un, Mark, an absolute wrong un, an absolute wrong un. So, that's what he wanted during C19. And he's had a number of business failures, Virgin Cola, Virgin Orbit, Virgin Cars, Virgin Publishing, Virgin Clothing, Virgin Brides. But he always holds this incredibly optimistic view. He's written, I suppose, the secret to bouncing back is not only to be unafraid of failures, but to use them as motivational and learning tools. And of course, where would any self-respecting globalist shield be without their involvement in WEF, the World Economic Forum? He's been there on a number of occasions. He's been there talking about climate risk and biodiversity and the power of going small. Could this be the answer to Africa's energy problems? Now, the answer to Africa's problems might be for parasitical shills like you to keep the F away from them. I would imagine that would be one of the solutions to Africa's problems. He's always been involved in politics. In the 1980s, briefly given the post of litter czar. Do you remember that? By Margaret Thatcher. He was charged with keeping Britain tidy. Tax dodging Richard Branson, charged with keeping Britain tidy. This stuff writes itself half the time. And he's also kind of like, again, as I say, he flip-flops between Conservatives and Labour, essentially whoever's going to sort him out. But in 2005, he declared that there were only negligible differences between the two main parties on economic matters, which is all he's interested in. Okay. He was also suggested as a candidate for Mayor of London before the 2000 mayoral election. And polls actually indicated that he'd be a viable candidate. But that never happened, thank goodness. And he's also fought for almost all drug use to be decriminalised in the UK. And he supported continuing Britain's membership of the European Union, and he was opposed to Brexit. I'm sure you're not at all surprised there. 11-11. Yes, indeed it is. And we're still rocking and rolling. Climate change, of course, is part of the whole scam. Absolutely, he is. He's discussed it with an assortment of people all around the world, including the highly problematic former US Secretary of State, John Kerry. And he's talked about it a great deal. He's a signatory of Global Zero Campaign, a non-profit international initiative for the elimination of all nuclear weapons worldwide. Global Zero has grown to 300 members, including current and former heads of state. He's been a speaker at the United Nations Conference on Sustainable Development. He supports the UN's Sustainable Development Goals, which we've talked about around here, which on the surface looks lovely and fluffy and very Richard Branson-ish. But once you dig deeper, you realize that it is a whole package about the enslavement of humanity. And he has absolutely dipped his toes into the whole net zero cash cow. Virgin Group had Virgin Fuels. It was set up to respond to global warming and to kind of exploit the spike that happened to fuel costs. And the idea was to offer revolutionary, cheaper fuel. And he also set up a global science and technology prize. The Virgin Earth Challenge was to award $25 million to the individual or group who are able to demonstrate a commercially viable design that will result in the net removal of atmospheric greenhouse gases each year for at least 10 years. Great PR move. But profits still come back to Branson, right? And he'd done different things. He pledged to invest the profits of Virgin Atlantic and Virgin Trains in research for environmentally friendly fuels and blah, blah, blah. And he also was reported to be bidding to buy the Honda Formula One team, and the discussions were underway, and the idea was that he wanted to introduce a less dirty fuel, and so he's had his hand in a lot of the net zero stuff. And as we've seen before with the net zero stuff, again, like foundations, they're like, we're giving this money, we're doing this for the good of the earth, but oftentimes their businesses are then linked up to the profits and returns on this. Dilip said removing the atmosphere's gases will weaken the natural barrier from UVs. They don't talk about stuff like that, though, do they, Dilip? What's he done for anybody? Humphrey wants to know. And of course, he's part of multiple different agendas. We heard that his daughter, Holly, revealed that she identified as a boy for 7 years. And she's back to being a girl now. Good to hear it. And he's always dressed up on multitude of occasions. I wonder if I can bring in some of his dressy up occasions. And anybody remember when he dressed up as a mermaid? Let me see if I can bring in that image. Here he is. There he is. He dressed up as a mermaid for a photo shoot. And it was during an all-female networking retreat. He wanted to highlight his playful approach to hosting, apparently. So he dressed up as a mermaid. He's dressed up on a constant basis. He loves dressing up. I do think he's a cross-dresser. I actually think he's a cross-dresser. He's done some really reprehensible things. Going back to when he signed the Sex Pistols, in later years, he created a Sex Pistols card. If you ever wanted to see the absolute death of punk, you would produce a Sex Pistols card, right? There's just no morality to these people. And of course, where would he be without accusations of some form of impropriety? He has been accused of sexual assault. Like many business magnates in this day and age, he has faced scrutiny over his treatment of women. Some of it's been really problematic. He's posed with women for his businesses who are in bikinis and stuff like that, really quite sexist stuff. But the woman who accused him of sexual assault was Antonia Janae, a friend of Joss Singer, actually a backing singer to Joss Stones, the singer. And she said, we were by the bar. They were at Necker. She said, we were by the bar and he was saying bye to everyone. He came up to me and put his face in my breast. He went brrr, and just walked away. It was surreal, totally out of the blue. Joss and I were like, what the hell was that? Everyone was wondering why I wasn't angry because I'm usually a firebrand, but I was just too shocked. Yes, because it's his island, balance of power. Hell knows what went on that island. Hell knows. Hell knows. And mermaids are perfect virgins. Yes, indeed, Randy, indeed. Wrong type of scales, not reptilian. And then, of course, going back to what I said earlier, and that is he irritated me over Madeleine McCann in September 2007. And Madeleine went missing, was reported missing in May 2007. And Kate and Jerry McCann eventually were made official suspects, arguido, and they came back to the UK in September 2007. And it was at that point that Richard Branson, even when they'd been made arguido over their missing daughter, he then pledged £100,000 to their legal fund, right, for Kate and Jerry McCann. And the donation absolutely helped them with legal expenses after being named arguido. But you don't see him doing that with like working class people, do you? You don't see that. And he also at the same time was pleading with his very wealthy friends to donate to that as well. And fairly atrocious stuff, because bear in mind that Kate and Jerry McCann only left PD. They said, we're not leaving Prada Luge until we find our daughter. And then they were made arguido. And I think a day later they left. Right. And they came back to the UK and they essentially refused to do anything. They didn't do reconstructions except for a Channel 4 program with private investigators that they had hired from Madeleine's fighting fund. And so I just think it's really, truly atrocious. Like, why are you giving these people money when they've been made an official suspect in the disappearance of their daughter? And by the way, again, I like to check on these things, right? So I went to both Wikipedia and I went to AI to see what they had to say about this. And they said that after that, Kate and Jerry McCann were cleared of any involvement in the disappearance of their daughter. That didn't happen. Please be careful. If you take your information from AI or Wikipedia, it is littered with, if not errors, then half-truths. Kate and Jerry McCann were never really cleared. They weren't. What happened was the investigation was shelved. And actually, at the Supreme Court, when they were having a legal fight with Gonzalo Amaral, the original police chief, about his book. These very high tier judges made clear that Kate and Jerry McCann had never been cleared, but yet nonetheless Richard Branson was out there supporting them and helping them. I love you too, Humphrey. Have a great day. Have a great day. So where would a wake-up report be without any reference to Freemasonry, Illuminati, esoteric, or the occult? Where would it be? And I just think that this is the most perfect picture, really. Anybody see him when he was dressed as a white rabbit, by the way? White rabbit has lots and lots of symbolisms. White rabbit is often taken from the whole idea of Alice in Wonderland and the white rabbit, the kind of keeper of secrets. But let me just see if I can find his white rabbit image just to pop in here. Actually, I don't know if I can, and it might take me too long. But you can find it. It's online, and he's dressed as a white rabbit. So that in itself, very interesting, interesting stuff. And again, as I say, a lot of it goes back to Alice in Wonderland and children, and somebody's pointing out adrenochrome and the Cheshire Cat, all of that kind of stuff. And so, yeah, he's done that. He's dressed up as the white rabbit, and as I say, he loves dressing up. He wears dresses, he wears skirts, he wears makeup. And I wanted to look into, because Lewis Carroll, right? I'd heard many times that he was a Freemason, but they won't acknowledge that online. They say no, but he was interested in a lot of kind of secret societies and stuff like that. But I'm not convinced. But there was a advertisement that Bono, our favorite person, Richard Branson, and actor Olivia Wilde made, where an ad for clean water, and it was in 2013, and they were making fun of Illuminati conspiracies, and Bono had done the same thing as well. And what you had was Richard Branson. So the video was about clean water. Let's be clear about that. And Richard Branson starts off by yelling, "Illuminati assemble." And it's weird. Why would the general public see the connection between clean water and that? It was just really, really weird. And Bono has done the same thing, really like making lots of jokes about the whole idea of Illuminati and Freemasonry. But I've got to show you this image. I'm the OG, Nikki. I'm OG. Let me show you this image. I thought this was great. Now, Prince Michael of Kent. Prince Michael of Kent is a member of the royal family, and he and his brother, his brother's now passed, but very high up in British Freemasonry. In fact, Prince Michael is still an active Freemason. He's the Grand Master of the Grand Lodge of Mark Master Masons, and he's the Provincial Grand Master of the Provincial Grand Lodge of Middlesex. And here he is greeting, let me just find this image. This I'm going to find 100%. Where are you? There it is. And here he is greeting. This is Prince Michael. And I think this was at Wimbledon, because there's another one of Camilla, who's like rubbing Branson's hair like he's a good little boy at Wimbledon. And it looks like the same thing. So I think this is at Wimbledon. Let me just show you this image. This is Prince Michael giving his mate a good handshake. You can see it very clearly. There they are together. And Branson is like in deference to him. Prince Michael of Kent. Yes, Marcuson. Absolutely. And so there they are in deference. And I started to compare the handshakes, because obviously really important stuff. The whole point about the Masonic handshake is it involves pressing your thumb against the other person's knuckle, which is what they're doing. And it seems like a standard grip, but it does. So my daughter and I were doing some handshakes this week just to kind of compare it. And when we do a handshake, we tend to handshake each other much more full on, but the Masons is very much about, yes, that thumb. Absolutely. So, the reality is that it's never been confirmed, by the way, that he's a Mason, but I would argue that he almost certainly is. I wouldn't be, not always. What's that? Not always, son. What's that? Talk to me. What's not always? What did I just say that made you say not always? Oh, I see. You didn't say Kent. You said a word that sounds like it. Got you. A handshake showing dominance in the ranks, because I mean the handshake is used by a lot of secret societies, obviously, and What handshakes change? Yes, you're right. Absolutely. Simon is somebody who does know about Freemasonry as well. I just felt that imagery felt Freemasonic, and I could be wrong. I could be wrong. So there you go. So on one level, I should like Richard Branson, right? His entrepreneurial spirit, his can-do attitude. But in keeping with other billionaire parasites, Richard Branson has been presented to us as a great British patriot who has done much for this country and promoting us abroad. But the reality is he has used the UK almost solely for his marketing purposes, to make money for his businesses while doing everything he could to pay the minimal amount of tax, while telling everybody else that people like him should be paying more. And he's got away with it because of this hippie image, because he's softly spoken, because he's gentlemanly, because he has the air of somebody who's living a clean living life. He is a fake who has misled people for decades. His relationship with Epstein was deliberately played down. He has benefited from being British while doing everything he could not to actually pay his full taxes and support the country. No, it's not illegal, but it is sodding immoral. He is a man who has said much, much, much. But the reality is about, much about saving the world, about being a humanitarian. But the reality is, when you break it down, he is no different to the rest of them. He has fooled the world by being what I consider the deceptive hippie. That's what I believe. There you go. He's so shady. He hides in the shade. Yes, indeed. So thank you for being here. Thank you for listening to me. I very much appreciate it. These are the things that I wanted to say about Richard Branson. And as ever, I don't claim that this is everything that's ever to be said about Richard Branson. It would be impossible to cover that. I've already been yapping for nearly 2.5 hours. But I just want to thank you for being here. I very much appreciate it. Is it Mark? Mark says it's definitely a Mason handshake. And so the thing is, the aim of this, obviously, the aim of this series is really just to show us that we have been sold a lie. We've been told that there are people in our world who are saving us, are here to save us, they're heroes, and they're none of the sort. They're depleting us, our natural resources. They're always looking out for ways to benefit them, their families, and their predatory friends. Did not know half of this, said Bethany. You're very welcome. Absolutely welcome. Thank you as ever to my wonderful donators, to Dinesh Nehru, to Merv Whitney, to E. Clark. Thank you for your kind donation. To Jade Torsig, to Hound Dog Shop, to Rosalind Dempsey. Thank you, Rosalind, on the live chat today. Very much appreciate it. And thank you, C Scotland. Same to you. I always appreciate it. And of course, here are the credits for my Patreons and other people who have donated. I very much appreciate you people. I truly do. Thank you, Peter. Thank you, Fun Times, very much. What's that? What's that, Randy? What you do so well, Sonia. My spark every Monday and Friday. Thank you. Well, I appreciate Randy, and thank you for supporting Wake Up, and thank you all. And I just want to, before I leave this planet, I want to expose as many people as humanly possible. Of course, one day there's going to be the dark side of Sonia Poulton, and who cares? Because if you've got clean hands, then you shouldn't have to worry about anything like that, which is more than could be said for people like Richard Branson. Take care, people. Love you lots. Thank you, Milford. Lots of love to you. And Vanessa and Jacqueline. Thank you, African Rose. Thank you. Very much appreciated. See you Monday, everybody. We've got a busy show on Monday. You're going to enjoy it. I'm introducing a new feature. Just to tell you about it quickly. And it's about kind of putting politicians on the spot, but in a decent way. So the idea is this, that I spent years in mainstream media, and what they do, these mainstream media presenters, is they are encouraged to provoke people, mostly politicians, so that they reveal their kind of inadequacies or their incompetencies or whatever. But it's very circular. It creates outrage on social media and in mainstream media for a couple of days, and then it's over and done with, and nothing ever moves on. So I don't want to approach stuff like that. So what I want to do is start inviting politicians on, local and national, to face questions from my live audience, or if you want to send in questions beforehand. And the first person who's been prepared to step up to that on Monday is Ben Habib from Advance UK, and more power to his elbow. I've told him it's not a PR event. that he will be asked live questions, and that's what we're interested in. Yeah, Lisa, it is TV clickbait, but that is getting nobody nowhere. So what we want to know is, what are these politicians truly going to do? So we want to start nailing them, right? Sounds good, Rachel. So if any of you have a question, feel free to send it in to me at soniapoulton@sky.com. And other than that, thank you, Sophie. Lots of love to you, and to you all, to Kerry and Frangleberry and Healing Guidance and all of you. Thank you, Sally. Lots of love to you. I'll see you Monday, peeps. Take care. Great weekend to you all. Thanks for listening.